Don't mess that up, Shirley. Okay, beginning again. My name is Shirley McCormick, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of the Harrisburg area. And on behalf of the League, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening. We are recording this, and it will be available on our website at a later date in order for you to review it or share it with friends. Any questions you may have, the chat room at the bottom, type them in, and we will have them answered as we go along. So it is my privilege to introduce this evening the Honorable Carolyn H. Nichols, Judge of the Pennsylvania Superior Court. Judge Nichols was selected to a 10-year term in the Pennsylvania Superior Court in 2017 and conducts the appellate review of criminal, civil, family, and orphans court cases. Previously, she was elected to the Philadelphia Common Pleas Court in 2011 and conducted felony jury trials in criminal court with equal justice, protecting the rights of crime victims and the accused. She supports activities promoting positive reentry to prevent recidivism and participates in community relations initiatives of the Southwest Police Division, including one called Turn a New Corner to assist returning citizens gaining employment, and another one called Blades, Fades, and Engage, a town hall style dialogue in neighborhood barbershops with the local community and law enforcement. In 2019, Judge Nichols co-founded the Southwest Division Youth Advisory Committee to facilitate positive activities for youth to move their lives forward with confidence and purpose. In 2020, during the pandemic, Judge Nichols participated in food and clothing distribution and neighborhood cleanup activities with grassroots organizations, including one called Unity in the Community and Ahari. Judge Nichols attended Philadelphia Public Schools and received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Temple and graduated from Temple University Law School with a Juris Doctor degree and a Master of Law degree in trial advocacy. Additionally, Judge Nichols obtained a Master of Business Administration from Eastern University. I don't know how you do all of this because just reading it made me tired. So I am extremely honored and impressed to have the Honorable Carolyn Nichols with us this evening. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Thank you. There's so many friends, and of course my family is here, and many friends. I see Gabrielle Gray from Pittsburgh and many others. So I had to give her a shout out. Mary Ellen, I haven't seen it so long, and Trish, and of course my mom. So thank you for inviting me. And today, we're going to talk about a very important topic. We're a week away from the primaries, and it's important to understand the history of voting rights. So we're going to unpack close to 250 years of history in 30 minutes. I promise it will be entertaining and informative. So as we go, whether we're filling out mail-in ballots or going to the polls or however we vote, we'll have a deeper understanding of the importance of the vote and all the blood, sweat, and tears it took for us to get there. So without further ado, we will start the presentation. Perfect. Okay, let's go here. And our presentation is The Urgency of the Vote, a History of Defiant Struggle. Now, starting from the very beginning, Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence in 1776 that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the whole struggle is around defining the governed, defining who can consent to being governed. What should consent of the governed look like? So for close to 250 years, Americans have been trying to figure out who can vote and how. The idea of America was to differentiate itself from a monarchy. A monarchy rules subjects. The concept of a democracy is that citizens are governed with the consent of the governed by the vote. In other words, the governed selects or votes for those who govern over them. That's the idea of the consent of the governed. So what does all of that look like? Starting out with the original Constitution, the struggle over voting rights began immediately from the beginning of America. And it dates all the way back to the founding of the nation. The original US Constitution of 1787 did not define voting rights for citizens. And the original Constitution of 1787 was the result of much conflict and compromise. And it was a bitterly contested constitutional convention with bitter personal conflicts and animosity, to the point that we know from the musical that Hamilton, that Burr shot and killed Hamilton, who was the treasurer at one point. Burr was, I believe, the vice president of the United States at one point, in a duel in 1804. So it doesn't get more bitter than that. In the original Constitution, voting rights were left to the states. And that was the compromise that the framers came up with, that yes, the government will be run with the consent of the governed, unlike a monarchy. However, the mechanism and what that looks like, we're going to leave that to the states to figure out. And primarily in the very beginning, the whole concern was white men with property versus white men who did not have own property. That was the conflict that the original framers saw. Who should have the vote? And originally, only white men with property could vote. And that's the way it was until the 1870s, until the 1820s. It started to change in the 1860s with President Andrew Jackson advocating for those who did not have property, such that white men without property began to be enfranchised in the 1860s. But in the original Constitution, the slave trade was allowed to continue for 20 years. Slavery continued until the 13th Amendment, which we'll talk about a little later. States were required to actively aid slaveholders in the recapture of fugitive enslaved persons. Blacks were counted as 3/5 of a man, which we've heard about lately in the census, and could not vote until the 15th Amendment, but that was only temporary because of Jim Crow. Native Americans were not counted in the census and were not considered at all, as well as non-English speakers. Immigrants that came weren't counted and weren't allowed to participate or vote at all. Women were denied the vote until the 19th Amendment, and Black women were also disenfranchised even after the enactment of the 19th Amendment, again, because of Jim Crow. There was no religious freedom in the original Constitution of 1787 or free speech protections until the First Amendment. There were no criminal justice due process protections until the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791, which consisted of the first 10 amendments. Now we go to the 1860s. Only white men could vote up until the 1870s, after the Civil War. So we see there's a lot on this page. So the constitutional basis for citizens to vote, regardless of race or gender, was a continuous fight and struggle. And it wasn't until the radical Republicans dominated the legislature after the Civil War that there was what's called the Second Founding Amendments, which is the 13th, the 14th, the 15th amendments. The 19th and the 24th amendments came later, which we'll talk about. And the 13th Amendment, simply and clearly, the 13th Amendment abolished the formal institution of slavery. There were over 4 million men, women, and children that were formerly enslaved, that were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, but this freedom was formalized by the ratification of the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1868, granted African Americans the rights of citizenship, because before that point, African Americans were not considered citizens. So in order to vote, you have to be a citizen first. So first, you had the abolishing of slavery with the 13th Amendment. Then the 14th Amendment, African Americans, Black Americans were granted birthright citizenship and were guaranteed equal protection of the laws and due process of the laws. And we have to note here that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, as we know, in April of 1865. And the new president, Andrew Johnson, was an adamant states' rights advocate and was fighting the radical Republican Congress every step of the way. With the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, that's where Black Americans were given the right to vote, and the right of citizens to vote was granted, regardless of race or color or previous condition of servitude. Also, an important thing is, you all may not know, the original Civil Rights Act was passed in 1866. So that was before 1964, 1866. Andrew Johnson vetoed that legislation, and this legislation was passed over the veto of President Johnson. That is the first piece of legislation in the history of America that was passed over the veto of a president. Now, subsequently, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was declared, I believe, unconstitutional at some point. And that's why most people aren't even aware that legislation even existed. All right, next page. Okay, so you might say, okay, we have, oh, before I go, I want to mention the 19th Amendment, which happened in the 20th century, 1920, which gave women the right to vote. And then the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes in 1964. I'm going to note those as well, but those aren't part of the second founding amendments. Some people might say, well, it should be game over, right? We have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. African Americans have been granted citizenship, equal protection of the law, the right to vote. What happened? Well, what happened is, for you history people, in the 1877, after Reconstruction, the Union Army left. And that's when you had the beginning of the Jim Crow laws, or the Black Codes, so-called separate but equal laws, which were upheld as constitutional under Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Now, primarily, we were implemented in the South, but similar practices were in effect throughout the country, including our state and other northern states. And this was effective post-Civil War until the 1960s, and it mandated de jure, in other words, legal racial segregation that was enforced primarily through intimidation and violence, including murder, and it affected all aspects of life, American life, public facilities, voting. There were poll taxes that people had to pay to vote, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, such that Black Americans were stopped from voting if their grandfather was not able to vote. So when the 15th Amendment was enacted, the segregationists came up with the grandfather clauses, such that an African American or Black American could be stopped from voting if their grandfather couldn't vote. And most Black Americans, their grandfather had been enslaved, so they couldn't vote. So therefore, they were stopped from voting. And there were all kinds of things, mechanisms. A jar with marbles was taken to the polling place, and the person had to guess how many marbles was in the jar, or how many bricks are in the Great Pyramid of Giza, and such things as that, to stop people from voting. So there was active voter suppression that went on, even though the 15th Amendment was ratified and was law, was the law of the land. Black Americans were still disenfranchised. And the segregation affected employment, housing, school, and transportation. It created institutional, economic, educational, political, social disadvantages for Black people. Even in 1954, with Brown v. Board of Education, which outlawed segregation of public schools, other forms of segregation went on. So there was a series of SCOTUS cases to outlaw segregation in all aspects of American life, including public facilities, schools, employment, housing. So it took quite a period of time to eliminate, at least de jure, segregation. But African Americans, Black people continue to fight to vote. And through my research for this presentation, I ran across this pamphlet circa 1900, which is called What a Colored Man Should Do to Vote. Because remember in 1900, women still couldn't vote. And I just love this quote that I have here for you all. As citizens of the United States, you cannot value too highly your right to vote, which is an expression of your choice of the officers who shall be placed in control of your nearest and dearest interests. You should vote at every election. In national and congressional elections, vote for the best interests of the country. In local elections, vote for the interests of the community in which you live. Never sell your vote. Never sell your vote. Those are powerful words that reverberate from 1900 until today. And I have another quote from the 1930s. One Georgia man described his inability to vote this way. Do you know I've never voted in my life, never been able to exercise my right as a citizen because of the poll tax. I can't pay a poll tax, and I can't have a voice in my own government. So Black people never stopped fighting to be part of the consent of the governed. We never stopped fighting for the vote. Now, in the 1960s, we have a period of time that many of us are familiar with, and we must never forget our fight for the vote. Many of you are familiar with Bloody Sunday, which occurred March 7th, 1965, in which voting rights activists marched from Montgomery to Selma across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they were attacked viciously by the Alabama National Guard, including John Lewis, who's in the foreground in the center photograph. And you see Fannie Lou Hamer, if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches. You know, she said she won't stop fighting. I won't back down. Okay, now we're ready for slide 8, in which we'll have a brief 4-minute video, which will talk more about the struggle of Black people to vote during the heroic period, which is the civil rights period in the 1960s. So I think I stop my sharing and then we'll enable the video to be played.
So his stuff on that, it wasn't, he's not playing.
All right, Carolyn, you might want to just talk a little bit about the video, but while I'm getting things set up here.
Okay, the video really provides a very concise, thorough explanation of the struggle of the right to vote, particularly from Fannie Lou Hamer, who's nothing short of heroic. Here's a woman that grew up as sharecropper and had to fight every step of the way, and severely beaten and attacked simply because she was registering people to vote in the Mississippi area. I think we're ready.
Right.
For the video. Let her speak.
At least on paper. The amendment passes and it's ratified. It doesn't mean that Black women.
I'm gonna back it up here and start all the beginning.
The vote, at least on paper. The amendment passes and it's ratified. It doesn't mean that Black women, yay, we can vote. No, now you're under the same restrictions that Black men were under after the Reconstruction period. It's an incomplete victory.
Native Americans have to wait 4 more years to even be considered citizens. Chinese immigrants won't achieve full rights until the 1940s.
People want to prohibit people from having free and unencumbered access because that means that power and resources will then be redistributed. And then who will that favor? And so there's this fear that's behind all of this.
In the segregated South, an organized effort keeps Black citizens from the ballot box.
Residency requirements, poll taxes, literacy requirements.
The very real threat of violence, of lynching, were visited upon communities who did try to exercise the right to vote, which was why there are vast communities, so people didn't even attempt to try to vote.
One woman brings the struggle to the national stage. Fannie Lou Hamer was born the last of 20 children to a family of Mississippi sharecroppers.
Growing up in the Mississippi Delta, she thinks, well, voting could help change my economic circumstances. And so I am going to try and go and register to vote.
She isn't allowed to register. Just for attempting it, she is fired from her job of 18 years and put out of her home. But she persists, becoming a voter and an activist.
The bus that she's in gets stopped, and all of the people who are with her who are trying to register to vote, they are removed from the bus.
Once again, women asking for their democratic rights are thrown in jail.
3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was State Highway Patrol. He said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead."
She is physically assaulted to the point that that assault has lifelong effects on her.
This time, there is no public outcry. President Johnson pays no attention. But Hamer does not back down. Instead, she launches a campaign for the U.S. Senate. Though the longest of long shots in a district where only 5% of African Americans are registered to vote, she uses the platform to raise her voice.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
In 1964, Hamer speaks at the National Democratic Party convention in Atlantic City.
We want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the freedom...
She told the story of what was happening to Black people in their quest for their natural born right to vote.
It's just America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America.
She used her platform to tell a story that I don't think many people in the nation knew.
She recognized that if the South was going to change, it was going to change at the hands of people like her.
1 year later, Congress passes a law to enforce the 19th and 15th Amendments, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
As much as we want the story of voting rights, not just for women, but for everyone in the United States, to be a forward trajectory, there are always new barriers that people find ways to put up.
Okay, back to Carolyn.
Back to me.
Yeah.
We really seeing that is important. I was looking right after the 15th Amendment was ratified. Scholars have identified more than 1,500 Black men that were elected to public office, including Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, who became the first African Americans to be elected to the U.S. Senate. The next Black person elected to the Senate was Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, nearly a century later, in 1967 from Massachusetts. So all of we heard the struggle that Fannie Lou Hamer went through. We'll go to.
So Carolyn, it might help us see even better if you were to put this in presentation mode.
Oh, okay, yeah, let me see if I can do that. Okay, there we go.
Mhm.
So we can never forget. Oops.
Yeah, just keep page
There
down.
we go.
Yeah. Okay.
Bloody Sunday, which we heard, Fannie Lou Hamer talk about, and everything that she went through, leading the Mississippi Freedom Party, the Mississippi Freedom Party. Fannie Lou Hamer went so far to go to the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City and attempt to be seated with the Mississippi Freedom Party. Of course, they were driven away. So the combination of the violent attack on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, as well as the treatment of the delegates from the Mississippi Freedom Party, in a lot of ways led to the enactment of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which included provisions outlawing the application, outlawing the attempts to stop the application of voter registration laws. So all these laws were on the books, but activists were still being attacked and stopped and killed. We see that violence was very often used by segregationists. Medgar Evers was shot to death in front of his own home in Jackson, Mississippi in June of 1963. Okay, next. Next we go to 1965, the Voting Rights Act. As we know, President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. President Johnson became the president subsequently, and he signed the Voting Rights Act 1965 in large part because of the activism of activists like Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others, of SNCC, of certainly John Lewis and Dr. King and Stokely Carmichael and Bob Moses and Ella Baker and Diane Nash and so many others that advocated for the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And we're not going to go through all of this in detail, but just to give you an understanding, the Voting Rights Act of 1964 removed the barriers that we talked about to Black enfranchisement in the South, the polling taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. All of these mechanisms were outlawed, even though there was a SCOTUS case on the books in 1915 that actually outlawed grandfather clauses. The segregationists still continued to utilize grandfather clauses, even though it was outlawed. So there again, in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, these mechanisms of voter suppression, which is what they were outlawed. And you have the several amendments. We won't go through all of those in detail. We don't want to drill down in the weeds, but there were 1970, 1975 amendments in which Section 5 was extended. And then we started to see changes in 73. The SCOTUS held certain legislative multi-member districts unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. In 1982, there were amendments. Congress again renewed in 1982 the special provisions of the act, which were triggered by coverage under Section 4 for 25 years. Then we have the 2006 amendments in which Congress renewed special provisions of the act in 2006 as part of the Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, Coretta Scott King, several, you see the names there, Reauthorization and Amendments Act. However, in more recent years, we know that the Voting Rights Act has been amended, and even though it's been amended and renewed, it's been tested in over 20 SCOTUS cases. And we'll talk about the RBG case in a minute. And some would say that that the Voting Rights Act has been diluted and weakened in a lot of ways. We demonstrate our consent to be governed by voting, because voting is our voice to select who determines public policies at the local, national levels. And you see all the critical concerns that are important to all of us involving the COVID-19 pandemic, healthcare, educational, criminal and social justice reforms, economic disparities, housing, social security, environmental justice, immigration, public safety, voting rights, and taxes, and many more. In Pennsylvania, we're one of 7 or 8 states in which judges, all of our judges are elected. So that means that we as citizens determine who will govern us, who will decide cases affecting our lives, every aspect of our lives, and criminal, civil, and family members. We as voters have the right to determine who will sit in judgment over us and our families and our loved ones. You vote, you count. Elected officials are more often more responsive to communities with higher levels of voter participation and civic engagement. And we know, we've been watching that recently, there are more than 300 bills that have been introduced in more than 40 states that are seeking to change voting laws, including absentee voting, voter ID, voter registration, voter poll purges, in-person early voting, disability access, provisional ballots, polling places, student voting, and voting for returning citizens. Finally, I want to end with our RBG, and to say that the fight for the vote is now. It has not ended. And you see her quote here. She's quoting Dr. King, and unfortunately, I might have to take it out of so I can read the quote. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, the steadfast commitment to see the task through to completion. She was quoting Dr. Martin Luther King in her scathing dissent in the Shelby County v. Holder case, in which SCOTUS struck down significant portions of the Voting Rights Act, which affected specifically Section 5. And she says here, as applied to Shelby County, she was referring to the VRA's, the Voting Rights Act's pre-clearance requirement, and she's saying it's reprehensible and contestable the way it was handled. And she pointed out the same can be said for Alabama legislators that were quoted in an FBI investigation of Alabama legislators referring to Black voters as Aborigines. This was in the FBI investigation, which was part of the record. And the Alabama legislators were openly discussing how to keep Black voters from the polls. And she said these events occurred not in the 1870s or even in the 1960s. They took place in 2010. Hubris is a fit word for today's demolition of the VRA. So we see that our work as citizens is still ongoing. You know, the fight for the vote is down. We're still fighting to be part of the governed so that we can exercise our consent to be governed, just as Thomas Jefferson said in 1776, that we as American citizens have the right to determine who governs us in all aspects of the legislature and all three branches of government. In Pennsylvania, we get to vote for judges at the state and at the local level. Other states, there are appointment processes, but in Pennsylvania, we get to select directly who judges over us. So we're still fighting, and we never stopped fighting to be part of the enfranchised. So it's a call to action. I know we're a week away and we're preaching to the choir here to exercise our right and our consent to be governed and to exercise the hard fought right to vote. And I will end there. I think I've been within my time frame. Good. And, if there are any questions, we're certainly happy to take any if there are any. I think that's it. Stop share. Okay.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat room. Does anyone have any questions for Judge Nichols?
A couple hands.
You see some hands?
I see 3 hands up.
You see 3 hands. So
I
Meg, you
see.
want to go first? Is your hand up?
No,
Okay.
no, well, my hand is up, but I think Trish and Mary Ellen and then me.
Okay. So Trish, you go first. Unmute
All right.
yourself.
Thank you, Judge. That was great. What I'm wondering is, with all of the impediments that are being proposed and enacted to impede voting, which one concerns you the most?
Well, I have to be careful because I'm a sitting judge, and Pennsylvania is one of the states in which some of this legislation is here. We're being recorded, so we have to exercise caution here and making prudent comments.
Sure,
But
yes,
of course,
I just need to put you on the spot.
but of course, my concern would be with any action to stop citizens from the right to vote. We can see that we've been fighting for the right to vote as women, as people of color, as people of immigrant birth couldn't vote for a long time, for 100 years, possibly to after the 1870s. So this is a hard fought right, and one of the most important rights of citizenship. Another important one is jury duty and participating in the criminal justice, being part of the criminal justice process. So I'll just leave it there, that without getting too far into commenting on any specific measure, because we have to be careful, because my understanding, there is legislation in Pennsylvania that could end up being litigated before our courts.
Sure, thank you.
Did you say Mary Ellen had a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mary Ellen.
Thank you. Judge Nichols, you mentioned the 361 some bills that are out there for voter suppression in the 47 states. And, we're like clearly going backwards. And I don't want to violate the Judicial Code of Ethics. But I remember hearing Ruth Bader say that whenever there were protests outside the Supreme Court, that did impact the judges. Is there anything you can say to us that where we can make an impact to kind of stop some of this voter suppression that's going on?
But what I will say is, you saw in the presentation that Lyndon Johnson was very moved by the civil rights activists, and so were the Congress people, the congressional representatives, to the point that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed in large degree. Remember the 3 civil rights workers that were killed in Mississippi as part of a voter rights campaign. Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Party. The attack of the activists on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that had a huge effect on Lyndon Baines Johnson as well as on Congress, and in a large way propelled the civil rights legislation to go forward. Now, of course, I'm not an activist, to be clear. I'm a judge. I'm not an activist. I stay in my lane. That's for others to advocate in that manner. I'm not a legislator. That's not my lane either. I'm not a member of the executive that creates the laws. We all remember junior high and learning about the pieces of government. That's not my lane. But we've seen from history, and you've seen in the presentation today, in the past, that action works. Agitation works. Legal, peaceful protests, let's make that clear, not some of the other things we've seen, has moved. And if the Supreme SCOTUS justices are saying that they were moved by it, then that would move them as well. Of course, I can't comment beyond that.
I understand, but that was really helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Specific provisions. We can learn from the past, and I think that's why it's important to understand that, particularly Black Americans, we've been advocating and fighting for the vote since the very beginning, because many times there's this perception that nothing happened until, the mid 20th century. And that isn't true. We've been fighting from the door since we got here. And not just Black Americans, but immigrants and other people that were disenfranchised as well, been fighting early from the very beginning of America to be part of being able to be part of this consent of the governed group, that we're not in a monarchy, that we're not going to be treated like subjects, that we're going to hold America to its promise that this is not a monarchy. Remember, America, that's what you said from the beginning, that this is not a monarchy, it's not a colony, we're not colonized, we're not subjects of a king or queen, we are citizens. We are citizens of this country. We have a right to select those who govern over us. And that is the rallying cry and the key that's reverberated since the very beginning of this country. So it's not something that just came up in the 1960s. That's why I love that pamphlet from the 1900s at the height of Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. And he's like, never sell your vote. I mean, if you repackage that, you could hand that pamphlet out today, because he's saying exactly back in that time. And the gentleman that said in the 1930s, I never got the chance to vote because of the poll tax. I've been cut out of this country, and we can't go back. We can't go back to. And it's true, we're not fighting literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, but we're fighting in other forms. Mm-hmm. The suppression of the vote. So we can't stop. We can't stop agitating for full and complete rights of citizenship, guaranteed to us in the U.S. Constitution as well as the Pennsylvania Constitution.
Thank you so much.
Did you see others, May?
I didn't have it. No one else has raised their hand. Oh, well, no, Sherry Ritchie did.
Sherry?
Yeah. Go ahead, Sherry.
There we go. Carolyn, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I really, truly enjoyed it. What impact, and I know there would be an impact, but how great is an impact for amicus briefs?
Oh, amicus briefs I can speak as an appellate judge. That I could speak on, because even as an appellate judge in Superior Court, we get amicus briefs, and they can be very persuasive. Because an amicus brief, it's a friend, of the court. So this is an organization that's interested in the issue, but is not a litigant directly involved in the matter. And the amicus briefs can be very persuasive in appellate cases. I mean, I can say that, as an appellate court judge, that I've seen quite a few amicus briefs, because they have a kind of a different perspective to the issue, and it kind of gives you a more global understanding of it without necessarily being you hear from the appellant and the appellee, of course, their briefs, but then the amicus briefs give another perspective of the issue as well. So they can be very powerful, a very powerful tool in appellate litigation, for sure.
Thank you.
Are there yes, May?
I was just going to ask a brief question, which is a little out there, and if you feel like you don't want to answer it, that's fine. But I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on or an opinion on ranked choice voting.
I don't think I want to take that on.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm just hesitant to really comment on anything that could end up, legislation.
I understand.
You never know what could come up in some of these proposals, and I don't want it out there. Well, she said that about.
No, I got it.
So I just have to be very careful.
Mm-hmm.
In commenting on things, other than to say, we're entitled to full citizenship.
Yeah.
It's been guaranteed to us since when? The 1870s. It's
right.
long overdue.
Mhm. But
that
you know
we
what
did
was
our due.
interesting? What was interesting about your presentation, though, was how constant the amendments have been. Right, one. You know, you fix one problem, right, and some other problem surfaces, right, is made obvious, or perhaps it was obvious before, but it wasn't fixed the first time, right? You know, when women got the vote, but the Black women were not included, you know, and Asians were not included, and you know, so I mean, there's so many things that as you take one step, you realize that there's another step that needs to be, you know, corrected and adjusted, and it's like this constant you know,
Because in a
push.
way, America was an experiment. You know, I'm not gonna, and I'm not downplaying the racism and certainly the slavery,
Right.
slave holding of the framers and all of that. But they were approaching it as an experiment because remember at that time, in the 1770s, there were nothing but monarchies in Europe because they were looking to Europe as a model. They weren't looking anywhere else. And everywhere there was a monarchy. So no one really knew well, how do we make this happen? When they created there was a lot of hubbub among the framers to figure out what to even call the leader. Some people wanted a king. And they said, oh, no king, no. No one knew what a president was or what a president did or what that was or how that would be. So we have to understand that as well. We understand that only white men could vote and only white male property owners. You had to own property in the very beginning of America to vote. So even white men that did not have property could not vote in the very beginning, but that changed as I said, through the middle of the 1800s. But there was a lot of, and that's why the convention was so boisterous, because there was such a fighting over something that they'd never seen before. America was an idea. How do we make this happen? And remember, we're looking at it with 21st century, in a 21st century perspective.
Right.
So there was no Zoom at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. They were working with who they were in the 1700s. And certainly it was from our eyes, we would see the racism, the misogyny, the sexism, and all of the other things with our eyes, that Native Americans weren't even in the discussion at all. And certainly immigrants, as they called non-English speakers, people who came to America and English wasn't their first language, were cut out. And as you said, Asian Americans, they were cut out and weren't even in the conversation. So we look at that and said, it's horrific that happened. But remember, this was the 1700s. And they were looking at Europe and looking at the world around them at that time. That's what went on. Even though England beat us to the punch, though. They abolished slavery before we did. So that they kind of beat us out. And so they came up with compromises. And to us, they're very ugly compromises. Even Frederick Douglass said how vile the original Constitution of 1787 was. And he lived during the time of, certainly the 1800s. And because look at what it was. The slave trade was able to continue until a certain period of time, and slavery was able to continue. They did have a drop dead date that the slave trade itself would cut off, but America was an idea. And we'll be 250 years old in 2026, America. So we're a relatively young country. When you look around the world, we're kind of, I don't know if we're teenagers yet, we're still young compared to other countries that have been around for thousands of years or a millennia. So we're still finding our way with this idea of America, which is still a new idea in a lot of ways. And as America has changed, that's why the Constitution was changed. Interracial marriage was illegal at one point. Same-sex marriage was illegal at one point. You could be prosecuted for that, for sodomy. Now same-sex marriage is legal. As America American society changed, then the Constitution changed. But certainly you wouldn't see those kinds of changes in 1787. So yeah, we find one problem and then there's another. You know, we have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, but then we have Jim Crow, because there was another compromise when the Union Army left the South and said, well, basically the new President Hayes said, well, newly freed African-American, well, you can call them African-American, colored people of that time, you're on your own, figure it out. And that was it. And that's where the black codes came in. So you had all of this powerful legislation on the books, but the reality is something very, very different. And in a lot of ways, we're still struggling today with segregation, but it's not de jure segregation, but I think the schools are probably more segregated now than they were in the 1950s in a lot of different ways. So the laws can't necessarily solve the problems because they're social problems, they're socioeconomic problems in a lot of ways. Personally, and I can say this as a sitting judge, we need to confront the challenge of poverty, which we have tried. Certainly we know about the Johnson, President Johnson, LBJ, not Andrew Johnson, obviously, but LBJ and the war on poverty in the 60s. And then that went out and other concerns came up. But a lot of the challenges we see are because of the economic disparities that we have in America. And courts can't cure that. You know, as a judge, when I was sitting in criminal court, and I don't want to talk too long, I don't know what the time is, but I'm sure Shirley will cut me off. But when I was a trial judge in Philadelphia criminal court, fully 70% of the people coming into criminal court were represented by the public defender, 70%. So that means 70% of the people, and that's just not Philadelphia, that's nationwide. That's Pennsylvania, and that's nationwide. So people coming into our system are in poverty by definition, because they're represented by the public defender. So all of the trauma and all of the socioeconomic challenges confronting that person, they bring with them to the court. And I wish I could wave a magic wand as a judge and make all that go away, but I can't. So courts can't solve it alone. And that's what we found out in almost 250 years. Constitutional amendments can't solve these problems. We see that. The Constitution has been amended over and over again. And we still haven't been able to solve all of the challenges. Laws are all over the place. We still can't solve all the problems. It's got to be all hands on deck with all of the branches of government, and not just government, with the public, private, all sectors of the American society have to work together to confront these challenges. Otherwise, we'll be enacting laws, then they'll be repealed, and then there'll be another amendment, and we can see that happening because law by itself cannot solve the problem. As a judge and as a lawyer, I wish it could. I wish it could.
Judge Nichols, you're right. I'm gonna have to interrupt you.
Okay.
Yes, and I am sorry because it has been so very interesting and the people seem so very interested in it. But we're going to have a business meeting after this, and we have to get our business dealt with. But I can't express enough how much we appreciated everything that you did. Beautifully done program and the time that you have spent with us. Again, thank you very much. You are welcome to stay for our business meeting, as are other people who are not our members. You're welcome to stay, but I'm sure that you are very busy just reading your bio. You have many other things that you need to take care of. Again, thank you very much. And I'm seeing people applauding all over the place. So again, thank you. And we'll move to our business meeting now. Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
And we'll see you all very soon.
Hopefully not. I don't want to be in front of you in,
Oh, no,
if that, I guess you didn't mean that, did you?
no,
Okay.
no, not necessarily in court, but
Okay,
but to
good.
talk about these issues.
Issues more. I'd love to.
And for coffee, for
For
coffee.
coffee.
Coffee. Okay.
Yep.
It sounds
All right.
All right, thank you. Now, what happened to my thing? There it is.
Shirley, can I add a comment here?
Yeah, sure.
Your chat is turned off.
It is.
Yeah, so we weren't able.
Thank you,
to-
because we thought we had it turned on.
It's turned on. I can chat to everyone here.
Oh, but
Yeah,
maybe
mine-
that's because you're a co-host.
Yeah, mine says chat disabled.
Okay, did you get this? This is a test?
I did.
Okay.
I
But I
think
can't-
that's because you're a co-host.
Yeah, I can't respond.
Hmm.